So in the last chapters, we saw how we could create different kinds of terrains and achieve very specific looks. And we rely heavily on the erosion node, as that is the glue that holds all our digital terrains together. Now, the erosion, or what's commonly known as erosion in digital terrains, is mainly fluvial erosion. And it's all based on soil coming down the slope with precipitation. So what about the other kinds of terrains and other kinds of erosions you might want to create? And that's something that we'll focus on in this chapter, because if you rely too heavily on just fluvial erosion, then terrains start looking quite similar. They can also look unrealistic depending on what kind of environment you put them in. So let me illustrate with this terrain. This is just a random file that I created on startup, and it has the typical mountain and erosion configuration. So with this erosion, we're already getting nice details, and this is a believable terrain. But this current look, it looks like there's a lot of sediment flowing down, and we don't want a smooth look like that. Maybe we want something more rough and rocky. So there are a couple of different things you can do. With the erosion node itself, if you have random sedimentation, I'm just picking a low value at random. So you can see it's starting to create little rocky deposits, and also the cleaner channels become slightly more turbulent and randomized. So that helps. But again, that just makes the sediment look more mixed in terms of granularity. It's not just soil, it's soil and rocks. So this is where look dev nodes come in. And so you can find look dev nodes right under erosion. There are a bunch of different ones. And so in this chapter, I want to take a look at those and see how we can create different looks very quickly. So if I wanted to turn this terrain into something more craggy and rocky and tougher looking, I would rely on anastomosis. So this is a very simple yet effective node. It takes the flow structures of any terrain, whether it's small or large, and it creates a deeper channeling in that based on certain parameters that we give it. So here you can already see the channels. These grooves have become way more intense, and we're just at default settings. And so we can expand this look. So let's look at the three key settings. The first one, impact, is the general impact of the rainwater coming down that flow structure. So if I were to increase that impact, you can see it's spreading out more. So the smaller the impact, it'll confine to these channels. Now, this setting doesn't stand on its own. It fits with the impact area. So if we increase the impact area, and then we increase the impact, the rainwater that was spreading out goes deeper, and so we get these structures. And let's say I were to increase the impact area quite a bit, you can see how it's starting to affect things. We get rock outcrops instead of just channels, and that's because the channels have become so deep and the sediment is being forced through so strongly that we get these structures, so all around. And the third setting, influence, is how deeply this influences our entire terrain. So if I were to increase the influence and click apply, you can see this really shatters the terrain. So I'm going to reduce the impact area. I'm just going to reset the impact. That's if you right click, you get the micro increments, and you can click this to reset, and I'll apply. So there, that's now already turning into a super craggy terrain. This is where you can control the influence a bit. There, that's better. That's more realistic. And then the last piece of this puzzle is the downcutting. So as we learned in the erosion node itself, downcutting is how deeply the channeling goes. And so with anastomosis though, it can work with predefined structures. So with flows, it will use the flow structure that's between all these crevices. And it has a bunch of these options. So if I change it from flows to rivers, you can see that it will now affect the larger flow structure, which would cause rivers. And then if I were to increase the influence quite a lot, just so you can see the parts that it's affecting, you can see there, this is what's happening. And now because all that excess sediment has been swept away, this now starts looking way more like a hardened terrain that you might find in deserts, for example. This could also be a bit of glacial erosion. So if, let's say, I were to add snow on top of this, and let me just reduce the snow line and increase the melt and intensity and duration. I just want to get things into these crevices. Melt a bit, or melt a lot, or a lot more, or even more. That looks good. And I will reduce the adhered snow mass, which will bring things further down, and same for the slip-off angle. I think my snow line is still too high. Okay, there. So with this, what's happening is, actually I should reduce the duration as well so we can see a bit more. There. The snow, with even at higher intensities, gets crevices to fill up. And that can help a lot in many different situations, especially if you want to have the snow flow down in specific channels. With just normal channels created by erosions, there's still a lot of chance for flow outside of those channels, but with this, that gets reduced. So if I were to now go back and switch this from rivers to, say, pits, that's actually quite high, so I'm just going to press Ctrl R and reset this to its defaults, and then I'll change this to pits. So with this, you can see it is now focusing on the smallest little flow structures, and because of that, on all these slopes, it's now creating these small pits, even here. And it accentuates the flow structure, but at a very smaller level, so we don't get the larger flows. It just ends up destroying all the smaller flows to create that finer look. And speaking of destruction, that's the lowest setting for downcutting. So at this, it becomes very small scale and isn't readily apparent. So you may have to increase the influence because it's more apparent at larger resolutions. But if I increase the impact area, you're seeing this, and so with more impact, you can see a bit more. And this is where it goes down to the grain of the terrain and starts creating a very small scale processing for the flows. And so if I move up here, you can see the bits that were being created before, those are being accentuated even more. The sediment that's flowed down, it doesn't get swept away, but rather it gets impacted just like the channels were in the other setting. Now, this may not always be something that you use for the entire terrain. You may want to mask out certain things, maybe based on, say, the deposit. So I'm going to take out the deposits mask and attach it to an FX node and auto level it so we can see. And I'll use Shaper to expand the area that's being impacted. And now I'm going to funnel that into the anastomosis mask. So there you can see more of the deposits that have swept down are affected, but not the rest of the terrain. So that's one way to use it. You could also paint a mask, for example. So I'll remove this and let's reset the node again. So this is the default anastomosis. So let's mix it a bit. So this is what I like to do sometimes. So I have this with flows. I'm just going to reduce the impact by half and double the, or even go higher on the impact area. I'm going to go all the way to 8, which is like I think 4 times more, and apply. So you can see now we get these beautiful deep crevices here. Then I'm going to create another anastomosis, and this one I'm going to go straight to reverse mode, and we'll increase the impact area of this one as well. Like we'll go 16, and with this one let's try really high, then we can go lower. Yeah, that's really deep, but that's good because I want to blend the two, so having it be a bit more exaggerated will help. And so then I just connect the two outputs to create a combine node, and here I can choose the level of blending that I like. Let's try multiply mode. Oops, that's a bit too much. I think I'll go back to blend, or you can even try min. Min will actually give you kind of both, and so that helps create something even rougher, like so. The other thing is anastomosis will also give you the flow output. So if I were to attach that to an FX node, so we could see there's the flow that it's using. It's somewhat different from the flow you would get from erosion. So let's compare. I'll create the erosion flow. So this is more of what it does to shape the terrain, while the anastomosis flow is smaller. It doesn't take into account the entire slope, but more of like the smaller features of the slope. And it also happens in a slightly different way than the normal erosion, as you can see here with the branching, and that is what gives us the effect that we see here. So with this though, and let's see, I can probably attach this to another FX node and combine the two to create a new map. And this one, I think I'll just go max and 100%. And then if I attach that to a SatMaps node, press G for combine, so that's the underlay. And you can see this is a great texturing component. So you can mix this with another noise, you could mix this with texture or one of the other data maps that we have here. One of my favorite data maps with this is the rock map. So if I put that to this, and let me pull this away so it doesn't get confusing. So there's the rock map. So if I were to combine these two and control the blend a bit, we don't want the rock map to take up too much. So you can get that kind of an interesting pattern going on. And so with anastomosis, you get that extra texturing power as well. So let me delete all this, and let's try something else. So we go back to our erosion node, and let's add a canyonizer. Now, we've used this before. Let's use it on a standard terrain. One of the reasons I like this is because it breaks up the uniformity of the terrain. Because we are using fractal noises and other things that are based on specific patterns, it's always great to introduce something that shakes things up. So here, let me change the lighting so we can see better. This is a fantastic collapse. There. Lighting's not pretty, but you can see what's happening here. This entire piece is collapsed. So I have these, and you can easily change the seed and get a different look. So there, oh, that's cut the mountain in half. That's cool. And the other thing you can do is not so obvious when you think of Canyonizer and what the name kind of makes you imagine, like this, that it's going to create these massive canyons. Let me reset Canyonizer, go back to the shape we had before, like so. And what I'll do is I will increase the octaves to say 10, and I'm going to reduce the depth to just 4%. And now let's hit apply. So what's happening now is instead of creating deep canyons, the octaves are creating multiple different canyons, sometimes overlapping, like you can see here. But with the reduced depth, it just carves a bit into the terrain. So we don't have to lose everything that we have on the terrain. Instead, we get these extra features that break the erosion a little bit and gives us like these smaller collapsed areas everywhere. So that is something you can apply on just about anything. And so let's try it on, say, a simple Berlin noise. Given that this is like really up and down, I'm gonna change the clamping a bit, basically just making this flat, nothing special. And then if I were to duplicate this canyonizer, that's Control D, and attach it to our Berlin. So you can see it's doing the same thing. It's creating all these multiple canyons on this. So with that, you could even break up something as simple and sometimes a bit predictable like the Berlin noise. So Canyonizer is a great way to do that. But like with anastomosis, it provides coloring components as well. So if I were to go here and let's say I am going to use the previous erosion node and I'm going to create a texture out of that. And so we have that, and I'm going to give that to SatMaps. And I will go and pin this so we can see, or rather I'll pin the Canyonizer so we can see how it looks on that. So that's okay. This is okay-ish. Some of the shapes don't match because we have the Canyonizer modifying the erosion node. And I think this is the SatMap may be a bit too complex. Let's go for something slightly simpler. Like that. That's nice. So what we can do is we can take the canyon extra output. So first we have depth. Let's attach that to an FX node so we can see. Oops, it's not generating, and that's why you're getting an error. To kind of make this faster, we have to go and click Generate Masks. And now if I go to FX, you can see that's the entire depth map of how the canyons are affecting that, or how deep the canyons are. So this we can take and introduce as a texturing component. So I'm going to combine these two, and we'll just leave it at a 50% blend to see. And now you can see the canyons get a different kind of a coloration. So we can go back to the blend, and if we change it to say screen, then go to SatMaps, again it's now being affected everywhere, especially where the canyons are. So this is how you can use that texturing component. And of course, the other one is you could just use the coverage map, which is basically a mask of the extent of all the canyons, regardless of their depth. And so if I were to, I can't attach it here because this is too flat. What we can do is I can create a second SatMap, and we can leave it this dark color, and let's combine the two SatMaps. But for the mask, I will give it that output, and if I go 100% blend, the canyon areas get separated with this coloration. Obviously, I've chosen something super dark. You can go for different colors, something that matches the other one more. And you can use that to create different mineral maps, or however your terrain works. Like obviously in this case, there's a lot more here that shouldn't be, so that would have to be masked out. But they should give you an idea of how you can use the two different outputs to create different impact in the texture maps. So now I'll delete these again, go back to our original erosion. And now this time let's take a look at fold. So fold basically applies a lot of terrain folding. And that's where tectonic upheaval has pushed plates in a slanted way outside, and then they start folding into each other. So this works on simple shapes as well as complex shapes. Both give different results. They can be dramatically different sometimes because folding can work on these tiny little crevices as well. With this, you can see we have these slabs here. They're slanted out. If I reduce the range, they become extended even further at the cost of some of that original shape. But it looks pretty cool, especially if I change the lighting a little bit. There we go. With this, you can see these slanted slabs better. And then if I were to increase the folding itself, you can see they get crushed into each other. There are also rifts between the different folds. So if I were to increase the rift, you can see it starts affecting the terrain dramatically. And then if you add a bit of erosion on top of this, you can see it creates these very, very different looking terrains than what you would normally see. Unlike the other ones, Fold doesn't have any of its texturing components because it's affecting the whole terrain so much. Personally, I like just having the texture node or rock map on that. It can create some interesting shapes, like I can show you with a rock map on the Fold node itself. So the rock map can bring out all the folding right here. And if you look at pictures of terrain folding in real life, this is not too different from what you get. So with this, if you use either painted masks or a slope mask to mask this area out, blend it with other texturing components, that can give you a very good look. The other thing with folding is you can change the angle. So it changes the folding and its direction without actually modifying the base terrain itself. So that can also give you interesting shapes. So in this example, you can see by turning this around almost 90 degrees, we get these instead of the long slanting shapes that we got before. Those shapes have of course moved on to this axis. And if I increase the scale, obviously that changes the overall scale of the folding itself. This is one of those nodes where even small changes can have dramatic effects. So one of the things I like to do is, like let's say with range, I will right click and use decrease by 1 to kind of see, oops, let me reset that. I'll go decrease by 1. And again, right click and decrease by 1 just to see, because sometimes when the edge is going over or the fold is going over that edge, it can create a lot of changes with just like a small value change. So I'm going to delete fold and we can move on to stacks. Now stacks is pretty fun. It takes any basic shape and it turns it into this mesa-like formation that you could find in the desert. And with this, we are doing it on erosion, so it has the added benefits of getting these channels. But let's say if I were to do it straight on the mountain, it works with that too. And you can see the difference is not that large. Stacks basically creates a bunch of these stacked terraces, but also adds folding and other smaller effects to give you a complex terrain from a simple shape quickly. So let's say, let's take a look at some of the core settings for this. So first is the number of cascades. So that's, and you can think of it as passes. How many passes of stacking do you want? And in each pass, how many stacks do you want it to create? So right now, it's doing 4 passes of 2 stacks each. So if I were to increase that to say, or decrease that to just say 3 passes, which is the minimum, you can see it's reduced some of the complexity. And if I were to reduce the stacks to just 1, it becomes an even simpler terrain. Now inversely, if I were to create 7 cascades, that gives me a lot more terracing and nice little crunchy detail. there are still fewer variations. So with that, if I were to increase the stacks to 6, now I get a lot more detail into all of this, and there's that extra variation everywhere. By default, we have a nice mix of how much stratification is exposed. So if I were to decrease that completely, you can see the change. You can see we have this general terrain, but the terrain retains more or less of an erosive look or a fluvial erosion look. It doesn't have that mesa look. If I were to increase the strata all the way to 100%, you can see this has very little flow and has a lot of exposed stratified rock. So that's why I like the default of 65, because it gives you that nice blend of both, like so. And so you get to have the best of both worlds. And then you can further modify it by increasing or decreasing folding. So right now I'll go all the way to the extreme, just so you can see. Now that's creating a very harsh look, which is really cool. Sometimes you can get a lot of mileage out of this. Although, like I said, it is an extreme setting. So by default it's 50, which is this. And then of course you could choose not to have any folding at all. And that creates a more cleaner mesa look, which is often something that you might want. So with this, there are no overlapping lines or hard shifts in the general terrain. And then the next setting, of course, is steepness. So with a higher steepness, the mesas or the terracing becomes quite stronger and the falls are steeper. You could also encourage strong flows, and it does exactly that. It will create deeper channeling, and if I reduce the steepness back to 50%, you'll see we get more flows as well. You could also add a talus pass, which destroys the bottom portions of the terrain to create this smooth talus created from the rocks falling down from here and through thermal erosion. And it gives you a very different kind of mesa. Again, this is something quite common you will find in deserts. And you could choose the power and the height of the talus. So if I were to reduce the height quite a bit, you can see it affects the bottom area only. And the added bonus of this talus pass is it starts creating a lot of pitted surfaces up here, because that's where it's extracting the rock to create this talus. Now let me reset the stacks node. So we can go from the default style to the sedimentary style. With this, the general concept remains the same, except instead of having a lot of rocky deposits, we now have smoother sedimentary deposits. And with this, if we encourage stronger flows, we get a lot more of this. So if you want something that looks like it's covered in sand, this would be a good option. And then we have the desiccated look. So this is where wind, thermal erosion, all these things affect it. It starts getting that pitted look, even though we don't have a talus pass. But at the same time, of course, unlike with the talus pass, you don't have to have the talus at the bottom. And so with this pitted look, again, if I were to increase the stacks, I get this more craggy, rocky look. And then finally we have the shattered. I'll reset this so we can see it in its pure form. So with the shattered style, the pitting process becomes quite extreme and the entire landscape gets more or less destroyed while retaining some of its original shape. So this is another one of those situations where you might want to have two different stacks nodes and then blend them using a custom mask of some sort. But again, this is a great way to create a very alien environment or something that's quite old and has gone through harsh conditions. So I'll go back to default, and so I can tell you about the cascades. So the cascades are, like I mentioned, the different passes that the terrain goes through. And so when you increase the number of cascades, it creates these extra passes. But what happens during a pass, because this is a byproduct of the erosion process that we know so well from the erosion node, you get these three familiar settings. So in these cascades, the erosive cascades, this is the duration, the softness, and the strength, just like we saw in erosion. And you can mess with that to change how each cascade works. So if I were to reduce the duration, you can see it does less channeling. If I were to reduce the rock softness, you can see the rock becomes quite hard and doesn't break away that easily. That I can kind of negate with a very high strength. So that's now starting to affect the rock. And if I were to increase the duration, you can see now there is sedimentation coming down, but at the same time the rock remains hard. So you can create lots of different permutations. And of course, this is controlled by the number of cascades. So let's increase this all the way to 10. It's kind of crazy, but let's do it. I like going to extreme settings because even by destroying a terrain, you can learn as to what it does. So now you can see with this, it's really accentuating the effect that we created because the cascades are happening repeatedly over all these different stacks. And so we get to control the different cascades. If I were to go back, let's just reuse this node. And so this is the default. And this is what we have with our modified cascades. So you can see this is a great way to control all that little minute details. And of course it works the same in, say, sedimentary mode. So we get a lot more of the sediments at the same time we get channeling. If you wanted even more sediment, we'll just make the rock softer. And there you can see that's affecting everything so dramatically. And so these are different things you can experiment with and get different results. You can mix and match. Like, for example, I'll just go up and create a talus pass on this, which is already so sedimentary. And we get this strange looking outcrop. I could see this somewhere in the Australian outback. And so there you go. There's the stack node. And it can create beautiful terrains. Let's quickly look at shear. So shear, kind of like Canyon-Izer, will create these collapses, but it does that by bending and twisting the terrain itself rather than just digging into it like the Canyon-Izer does. So what happens is we get shapes that are more in sync with the overall terrain or those local portions of a terrain. And so with this, like I said, it twists and warps and bends. So if I were to increase the folding in this, you can see it's really tearing my terrain apart. I'll go back to default, but then I'll change the direction. Let me do it little by little, so you can see how it's being affected. And like with Canyon-Izer, this is a great way to introduce some rockiness and randomness to your terrain. The shear node is pretty simple, so just play with it to get an idea. All you have to do is really just choose the scale of the shapes that it's creating. For example, I like slightly higher shapes when or higher scaled shapes when I'm doing a lot of folding, so that way it affects the terrain like this rather than creating lots of small pockets. I'll reset the direction. Let's see how that affects our terrain. There you can see it's such a large shape. It's not carving away entire swaths of this. Instead, it's just a little bit here, a little bit here, and I can of course change the seed to see. There's that. It's nice. It becomes more subtle with a higher scale. When I bring it down, it can become stronger. And finally, we have the self-modulation. So if we do that, the twisting and turning kind of takes reference from the terrain's shape itself. So it's more guided by the shape that we already have. and can create very interesting effects. Like with the other one, it's like if you have that, it's better to go with a lower folding. Like higher folding will create so much of a difference, it can alter your shape completely. And because it's self-modulated, there's no scale, so we can't rely on scale to tweak it. The scale will always be what the terrain itself is. And so with this, I like controlling it with just folding. So you can see how it's happening. It's twisting the terrain further and further until it starts ramming into itself, so to speak, and starts creating these. What you do have is the direction, of course, so you can change the direction of the impact and the folding. And so another useful node to quickly get a look going. Maybe that's why they're called look dev nodes. Okay, let's go to Carver. Carver's a weird one. Carver's more of a roll of the dice in a way. So with that, I don't like defining my shape too much before applying Carver, because that's the node's job. It's going to go in, and as the name says, it's going to carve a lot of material out of that terrain. So I'll even get rid of this erosion node. Let's just go straight to this mountain. And you can see it's creating this super complex shape. And that, if I were to erode further, gives me this beautiful, random looking, well, random in the sense of the uniformity of features. It gives me this beautiful look, and I can use the min mode to kind of retain some of the cooler carves way down here. So yeah, that's the job of the carver. Like with the erosion node, it does the process in the same way, but it's more about carving these channels than worrying about sediments. So the iterations obviously increases the number of passes that the terrain goes through. And with each pass, it kind of slightly expands the channels, which you can control further. Like if you want to control the depth, then you can increase the erosion power. The channels go deeper. With lower iterations, the channels are finer. And like you can see with the erosion power, they go super deep. And unlike the normal erosion channeling, there's a bit of displacement here. It's an artificial way to take our existing flow structure and modify it to create these cool wavy patterns. And so you can choose how much displacement is applied per iteration, and you can get these amazing flowy shapes. Obviously, you don't want erosion power this high. That was just to see, but like this. Or if you go even really low, like this. If you look at the normal terrain, and then if you look at this, it's like, yeah, I did something. There's something strange going on, even with lower erosion. It's like, oh, that's cool. And of course, with the displacement, you can change the direction in which something displaces. And you can change the direction in which it displaces. You can change the seed to get all these random shapes or random channels. It's pretty simple, but at the same time, it's very effective. And it's one of those nodes that are better off very early in the graph when you're creating your primitives, so you can start shaping them with these erosion-friendly features, as I like to call them. Because if you have these channels and then you put erosion on top of it, let me take off the min mode. It will follow those channels more than it does anything else, because that's what erosion does. So let me take these away, and let's look at surface. Surface is a small but very powerful and important node. I rely on this a lot for the finishing effects on a terrain. But I want to show you first on just the pure mountain primitive so you can see. So what this is doing is taking all the rock material from that basic shape, and it's making it rougher and giving it that rocky look here because we have chosen the rough style. Now, if I choose the rocky style instead of the rough style, it'll instead place lots of tiny rocks, or, well, judging by the scale of this, these are boulders, so you get that everywhere. And as I mentioned, this is more of a finishing effect than something that helps you shape the terrain itself. So let me illustrate that by adding, say, well, let's add a couple of look dev nodes. I'm going to add stacks, and let's do a bit of a shear. So they're pretty simple. I'm just going with defaults. I haven't really done anything. And now if I add the surface node on top of that, you can see it's making this all rougher. So it basically accentuates what's there. In mountain, we have all of this little detail, and it was accentuating that. Now it has clearly defined shapes, and it's making them more pronounced. And you can choose the coverage. If you go lower, it starts focusing more on even tinier areas. With a higher coverage, it focuses more on just the sharpest of these crevices. And of course, the strength controls how deeply that's impacted. You also have the density, which is the density of the rock material. So if you increase that, it like expands that rock, and it will even fill in some of those crevices. Let me reset this, and we'll switch from the rough to the rocky style that we saw before. And there you can see it's placing a lot of rocks everywhere. You can choose the strength. So obviously with a higher strength, it becomes this. And so you can imagine this is something you might want to use with masking, so that it doesn't take over your entire terrain. And if I go back to the default, that's what, 25%. That's nice, especially for a distant terrain where you might want to show a rocky surface. This can be very useful. Now the last look dev node that we'll take a look at is the shatter node. As the name says, it basically shatters your terrain. While shear twists and warps localized portions or sometimes larger portions of your terrain, and Canyonizer carves deep into little canyon-like structures, or maybe larger canyon-like structures, shatter basically goes and randomly starts destroying everything. Somewhere you can see it's quite tougher on the terrain than in other places. But if you're looking for a shattered landscape with exposed rock here and there, smoother areas in others, this is a great node to quickly get results. Let's try it on a different kind of a primitive. I'm going to create a slope noise, like so, and I'm going to use Shaper to kind of give it a steeper, or actually give it more of a bulbous look, like so. And let's reduce displacement a lot so we get this less pitted surface. Finally, I'll change the angle a bit so we can see what's going on. And if I attach that to shatter, you can see what it's doing. It's creating massively powerful erosion. It's only visible because we have this massive slope for you to look at, or rather for the terrain to process. If I were to take that away by clamping this down and reducing the slope, and there you can see kind of a bit of both. So that's what shatter is. Shatter is a super high-powered version of the erosion that basically shatters the terrain, but it doesn't do it in a uniform way. And it's quite simple to control as well. So you have your collapses, and with that, with a higher value, let me go a bit higher on that. So there, you can see the collapses are stronger and they're spreading out everywhere. If I were to go back to just one, you can see there are smaller areas that are being collapsed. Obviously, if you increase the strength, you can see that erosion becomes even more powerful and starts shattering this more than creating these flowy structures that we're so used to seeing with erosion. In fact, with a lower value, if you have a slope, if I go back, you can see with a lower value, there is some of that fluvial erosion going on. So if you get that because of a slope and kind of don't want it, just increase the strength. And you can see it does less of the fluvial erosion, more of this deep destructive thing. The other cool thing you can do is you can change the feature scale. So if I were to go really low, you can see the impact and the destruction being created everywhere is confined. It's confined to smaller local areas. If I go very, very high, it can start taking over giant swaths of the terrain. So if I just reset it to default, there you go, that's what you have. This is something I often relied on to quickly create like these semi-shattered hills. For example, this is more or less what I had to do on a real project. So they wanted to have rolling hills kind of a look, but at the same time have little rocky parts exposed to kind of show that there's a sedimentary layer on top of the terrain, but at the same time underneath it's all very rocky. So I created a Perlin noise with very little octaves. Let's see, something like this. I'll even reduce the warp amplitude because I don't want this to get warped too much. So let's see, something like this. Finally, I'll increase the scale just a little bit. On top of that, I started adding a bit of recurve because I wanted this kind of a slight angle to things and just wanted to compact things up a bit. You can increase the duration to have more of that effect, which I think will look cool. And then finally, I'm just going to clamp this down a little bit. And so there, that's that typical rolling hill kind of a look going on. Now, if I attach a shatter to this, there you go. You have smooth areas and you have the rough areas. With the collapses, I'll go lower. And with the strength, I'll go a little bit lower as well. And same for the features, because we don't want it just being everywhere. And there you have it. You have some of that smooth hill structure going on along with these. I can go back and with the Perlin, let's try, say, a different seed. Or we can even try a billowy look. Although that's creating more of a peak structure, but that's still cool. In a way, you can see how this is working, and all this exposed rock that's being created. So it's not just little pieces of debris like what you're seeing here, but you will get these. So you can see there's a bit of like a multi-strata that's been slanted, and it's now creating these cutout or rock outcrops that have been cut out from this base shape. You can see some more of that going on here, and obviously if I change the seed, I get these different collapses in different shapes. So I'll go back because I think below is not working that well. There we go. And I will bypass the recurve this time, which also has the clamping. Let's see what it looks like with the higher one. And there you go. This has now turned this into a shattered hillscape. It's no longer our rolling hills. And that's because of the stronger slope. So with this, I would go and collapse this. Maybe bring it up a bit, because even though you don't see it here, this is all material it can use and carve into. So that's a little pro tip for you right there. And there, you have this. Now, Shatter doesn't provide a mask, but you can easily create one. I believe a future version is going to have a mask for this, just so you can get, like with the Canyonizer, you can get both the depth and the overall coverage. But I'll show you a quick way on how you can do that yourself. Let me get rid of the extra nodes here. So what we have is basically the before and after. So let's connect these two to create a combine node, and the combine you set to difference and 100%. What it does is it gives you your the difference between the two. So this is the positive form of the shattering that was impacted into the terrain. So all this here is all this here, just inverted. And so let's say if I were to go shatter and combine it with this, but went add and 100%, we get this. So this is what we took out, this is that, we're adding it back. So if we were to visualize this as a texture and not as a, or rather as a mask and not as a terrain, which I'll right click, show as mask. Not too visible, we'll need an FX node. And I'll auto level it so we can see. That's your depth mask. So if I were to say, or here I will add a SatMap node and I will set shatter as our underlay. And let's find a different texture map. I'll go in the sandy collection. And there you go, something like this. So you can see the pockets are being highlighted here because we now have this depth map. And then you can you could use the bias to kind of like bring it out a bit if you want. Inversely, you could do something similar here in the FX node by turning on Shaper and expanding this, or not. You can go bring it in even lower. But the one thing you can do is you can go abs on this. Actually, if you want control, let's do one better. I'll just do auto level here so we get a higher grade between the differences, so it's like a more contrast. And then I will create an abs node. This basically turns everything into a 1-bit map, so it's either black or white, and then we choose the threshold. So anything that's 50% gray or higher will be included in this. So as I go lower and lower, more and more of the collapsed parts, which is, let me go back to this as a terrain view. So what I want is for it to stop kind of here. If I go too low in my threshold, it'll start covering even these tiniest of impacts. That's not something we want because it's going to be a flat map and not like a graded depth map. And so here, I can control that a bit. Let's see. So let's say this is something I like. And now I can have, say, I'll take the shatter, give it a texture node to create a more generic texture system for the whole thing. Give that a sat map. That doesn't look nice. Let's find something better and something that's a bit different than our than this map. So yeah, maybe something green or whatever will do. There, this is different enough. It's not the most aesthetically pleasing, but again, we just want it to be different. I'll stick with the dark map for now. And so if we were to combine these two, and like we've done before, use this as the mask, you can use this to color the collapsed areas differently. That's something that I had to do to create the rocks. Although what I did was, instead of using the depth map, I actually took the combined thing, or the FX thing, the auto level thing, and I used a rock map on it because, as you remember, my brief was that it should be rocky stuff that's exposed under these nice rolling hills. And so I'll mess with the coverage just a bit to get it more rocky. Let's play with the density. Actually, I think I want high density. And now that is what I'll give the sat map here. Let me space this out a bit. And so that's what we're getting. Now if we go here, there's our little rocky stuff down here, and there's the not so green looking grass. I think gives you an idea of what happened and how you can achieve that kind of a look.